June 18, 1452, Pope Nicholas V issued the Dum Diversas Apostolic Edict, declaring total war against the people of Africa. The Kingdom of Portugal invaded the coast with the object of reducing African people to perpetual servitude, and thus started the longest ongoing war in modern history, known as the Dum Diversas War. African people on the continent attacked the hostile invading military forces throughout the war. It is estimated that 100 million African people were killed as a result, and 12 million were trafficked as prisoners of war across the Atlantic to the Americas, where they suffered chattel enslavement and ethnocide. Those prisoners also attacked the hostile invading forces aboard their warships and conducted sabotage and revolts in the land of their captivity. In 1713, England acquired the Catholic Church's monopoly Dum Diversas Asiento war contracts to supply Spain's American colonies with 4,800 prisoners of war annually. And on June 21st, 1788, the United States officially entered the Dum Diversas War, when New Hampshire became the 9th of 13 British colonies to ratify the United States Constitution. That Constitution prohibited Congress from outlawing the trafficking of African prisoners of war for 20 years. A fugitive slave clause required the return of runaway prisoners to their enslaving owners. During this Dum Diversas warfare, the descendants of those African prisoners of war experienced ethnogenesis, the formation and development of a new African ethnic group composed of a mixture of various African genetic material, some European and indigenous nations' genetic material, living primarily in the American South with its own culture and heritage. President Abraham Lincoln issued a Dum Diversas War ceasefire in 1861 that was reversed after his assassination. Both W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey petitioned the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 for control of the former German colonies in Africa as reparations to be used to establish an independent new African sovereign nation. This, of course, was denied, and the Dum Diversas War continued on both sides of the Atlantic using the newly created scientific colonialism, the foundation of the League of Nations mandate system of controlled warfare. In 1955, Queen Mother Audley Moore founded the Reparations Committee of Descendants of United States Slaves. In 1957, Queen Mother Audley Moore presented a petition to the United Nations, and a second one in 1959, arguing for self-determination, against genocide, and for land and $200 billion in reparations. Just 5 years later, Malcolm X told the African heads of state at the Organization of African Unity's second summit meeting in Cairo, he quoted, "Since the 22 million of us were originally Africans, who are now in America, not by choice, but only by a cruel accident in our history, we strongly believe that African problems are our problems and our problems are African problems. If South Africa is guilty of violating the human rights of Africans here on the mother continent, then America is guilty of worse violations of the 22 million Africans on the American continent. And if South African racism is not a domestic issue, then American racism also is not a domestic issue. We beseech independent African states to help us bring our problem before the United Nations on the grounds that the United States government is morally incapable of protecting the lives and property of 22 million African Americans. End quote. Kenya, Burundi, and Tanzania promised to bring the new African case for reparations before the United Nations. 2 weeks after Malcolm X was killed, the case against South African racism, also known as apartheid, was brought before the International Court of Justice. But the case against American racism has yet to be brought before the International Court of Justice. In response to the growing new African nationalist consciousness, the United States revised its dumb versus war strategy against the new African nation, designating it as the #1 national security threat under the U.S. counterintelligence program known as COINTELPRO. On March 31st, 1968, the Republic of New Africa declared its independence at the Black Government Conference held in Detroit, Michigan, stating, "We claim no rights from the United States of America other than those rights belonging to human beings anywhere in the world. And these include the right to damages, reparations due us for the grievous injuries sustained by our ancestors and by ourselves by reason of United States lawlessness." End quote. A dumb versus war action under COINTELPRO took place at the Second Republic of New Africa Conference on March 29, 1969. Police raided the Detroit New Bethel Baptist Church. The police attempted to assassinate Gaidi Obadeli and fired on conference participants with nearly 1,000 rounds of ammunition. The dumb versus war was then rebranded in the United States as a war on drugs and was officially inaugurated by President Nixon in June 1971. According to John Ehrlichman, assistant to the president for domestic affairs under President Richard Nixon, he said, quote, "You want to know what this war on drugs was really all about? The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." End quote. In other words, the United States initiated a legally permissible form of slavery under the U.S. 13th Amendment. The Republic of New Africa drafted an anti-depression program which called for a lump sum reparations down payment and a negotiating committee between its subjugated government and the U.S. government, and successfully had the program adopted at the 1972 National Black Political Assembly Convention, held March 10th through 12th in Gary, Indiana. 8 days following the convention's conclusion, on March 20th, 1972, President Nixon said, quote, "We must wage what I have called total war against public enemy #1 in the United States, the problem of dangerous drugs." End quote. On July 28, 1975, Queen Mother Audley Moore, the first signer of the Republic of New Africa Declaration of Independence, addressed the 12th summit of the Organization of African Unity in Kampala, Uganda, calling attention to the new African independence movement's exercise of self-determination and demand for land and reparations, and pleading with the Organization of African Unity to bring its case before the World Court. The United States responded by issuing National Security Memorandum 46 that extended the COINTELPRO to the international arena, targeting officials of African states and African nationalist and liberation organizations and their leaders to prevent their coordinated action with the Black community in the United States. The new African independence movement responded with increased demands for reparations while preparing the people for urban warfare. The African National Reparations Organization hosted its 10th International Tribunal on Reparations for African People in the United States in Philadelphia in November 1991, which was then followed by the first Pan-African Conference on Reparations held in Abuja, Nigeria, April 27th through 29th, 1993. The Abuja Proclamation urges the Organization of African Unity to grant observer status to select organizations from the African diaspora in order to facilitate consultations between Africa and its diaspora on reparations and related issues. End quote. On February 4th, 2003, the successor to the OAU, the African Union, adopted the Article 3Q Amendment that invites and encourages the full participation of Africans in the diaspora in the building of the African Union in its capacity as an important part of our continent. Both the Accra Reparations Proclamation of 2023 and the African Union Transitional Justice Policy of 2024 will seek to connect advocacy groups in Africa and the global African diaspora for a common and united reparations agenda. The Provisional Government of the Republic of New Africa, through its Ministry of Foreign Affairs, has sought to reestablish the relationship initiated by Malcolm X through the OAAU and carried on by Queen Mother Audley Moore at the OAU. On February 3rd, 2024, the PGRNA applied to renew the observer status at the African Union. On February 26, 2024, the PGRNA submitted a brief to the AU Legal Reference Group. The Provisional Government of the Republic of New Africa submitted a follow-up letter on July 12, 2024. The African Union's Justice for Africans and People of African Descent Through Reparations theme for 2025 provides an auspicious moment to make good on the Abuja Proclamation of 1993 and the Accra Proclamation of 2023 by establishing the Common Reparatory Justice Partnership between Africa and New Africa. The AU is being called to renew the observer status to the new African independence movement through the Provisional Government of the Republic of New Africa and assist in bringing its request for an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on the status of Afrodescendant people as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention and their right to conduct plebiscites for self-determination, which has already been submitted to the United Nations Permanent Forum of People of African Descent at its second session.